Welcome back to the Centre for Teams and our series of webinars entitled Adapt, aimed at providing you with practical guidance and insight at a time of great change. I'm David Webster, Director of the Centre for Teams, and I'm delighted to welcome Steve Scown here today, CEO of Dimensions, one of the country's largest not-for-profits supporting people with learning disabilities, autism, and challenging behaviour and complex needs across the country. So Steve, welcome. I know that you have a large staff, so 7,000 people across the country, and you've been supporting them throughout all of this process as they support those you serve. That must have been quite a tough one to do, given that so many of you were isolated and therefore needing to stay safe.
I think, David, it's fair to say this has probably been the toughest challenge of my career, and I know a lot of my senior leaders also feel the same. It's been all sorts of words can be used. It's been an interesting few months, to say the least.
I'm going to introduce you, and then we've got some questions to kind of guide our conversation. But I'm fascinated by the journey that you've taken, and I think it'll be a great opportunity to get some insight as to the kind of work that you do and how you've done it at this time, and particularly those who know much less about the health sector and those supporting people out in the community such as you do. So I'll introduce you now and then we'll go to the questions. So Steve trained as a learning disability nurse at the high security Rampton Hospital and worked in a number of NHS management positions before joining the voluntary sector in 1993. Before being appointed as Chief Exec in 2011, Steve led Dimensions organisational development work in championing the personalisation agenda. A speaker at UK and international conferences, he co-authored the winning books Making It Personal and more recently Making It Personal for Everyone. He has an MSc in Public Service Administration and a keen interest in understanding how organisations undertake change and how they contribute beyond their organisational boundaries. He's chair of the Voluntary Organisations for the Disabled Group. So Steve, a big welcome and thank you very much for joining me today.
Hello, David. Nice to be with you this morning.
We've had a number of conversations over the last few months about the challenges that we've all been facing and grappling with. I'm wondering if you could take us back all the way to when you first realised that this situation was coming towards us all, and to your organisation in particular. Where were you and when did you realise that this was a big challenge? And how ready did you feel and did your organisation feel for the challenges that lay ahead?
I guess I woke up to the seriousness of this back in about mid-March. I remember I was actually having a long weekend off. So 13th of March, I think it was Friday, I was on leave and we had our first pandemic emergency response team meeting, PERT, which became one of our interesting and most memorable words of the organisation, I think. We'd had a pandemic response plan for about 8 years. We'd clocked it as a potential risk. We'd had some conversations with our insurers. We'd do an annual review of our risk register, and they'd always said that global CEOs and global organisations saw a pandemic as a potential high risk. So we were sort of like there in the background, and we had our plan, and we thought that's okay then. We saw the emergence from China and then into Italy and all that, if you remember it back. So we went off on this long weekend, didn't go away, just did a bit of mooching around at home. Came back on the Tuesday, and Jackie, who's my number 2, said, we had a meeting on Friday, we've closed our services and we're closing down all our offices. And I went, right, okay. Right, just say a little bit more. So that's, I think, when it began to hit us that actually we had to do something. So we locked down our services. We locked them down about a week before the country was locked down. And we then were in the midst of closing our 34 offices around the country, which meant that 350 people, colleagues, who ordinarily work in an office were all of a sudden having to work at home wherever they could. So I guess that's when it hit us, I remember our pandemic emergency plan, as it was, we now say it basically got thrown out the window on day one, because we'd had this naive expectation of a weekly meeting just to check how things were. And we ended up working, I think I'm right in saying we worked right through from the 17th right through to the early April, 7 days a week. Colleagues were working pretty much 7:30 through to early evening, trying to get the organisation into a sensible place, I guess. So that's when it really hit.
And what was it like for you personally and for your top team? What was the experience like of those early days?
I think the word intense might be a relevant word here. It was, looking back, I guess it's fair to say it was a little bit exciting, if I'm being honest. There was a bit of a buzz. There was lots of energy, commitment, determination, all the sort of management words you'd expect. But the word I remember as being intense. I think we'd started using Teams about a month beforehand, just as a way of making calls and sharing data, sharing files, etc. We soon became pretty proficient at Teams. We've also used Zoom, but yeah, so hundreds of colleagues were working out how to work differently, and we had to work out what our priorities were for that period as well.
So when we have spoken about this in the past, you've spoken about the kind of rhythm that the team in particular took on, which I found fascinating, because instead of teams, we talk a lot about slowing down to speed up. We talk a lot about the idea of playing around with the concept of time, so that you can actually slow down to make big decisions and speed up when you need to. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about that kind of rhythm, that kind of tempo, because because lots of organisations went through that, very high response, rapid response to the crisis.
Yeah, no, our Pertical, our pandemic team membership was quite. There's about 9 people, I think, and we were meeting at 8 a.m. Meeting in Teams, 8 a.m. And we did that for weeks and weeks, and thereafter if you like the corporate headquarters team, then different functions. So HR would then have their daily call, operations have their daily call, IT would have their daily call, and so it cascaded down through the organisation. So what I wanted to do really on was get a rhythm. You used the word. It was very much getting an organisational rhythm, and that culminated in after about a couple of weeks, we instigated a question time where our managers, we got 300 frontline managers dotted around the country, so they could call up to ask any questions. But the key thing we got right, I think, was we did a daily communications briefing at 5 p.m. and it went out at 5 p.m. And that really, we did one to all colleagues, so all 7,000 of our colleagues could have access to that, and one to all our managers and leaders. So there was 2 very different types of messages going out, and all internal communication went through just those two email communications at the end of the day. And one of our managers turned around and said, well, a lot of our managers have complimented us on the clarity of that communication and knowing it was coming. And one described it as his anchor point. And what I think we found was that if we go back, there was an awful lot of confusion nationally. Press were all over the place. Government announcements were a bit haphazard. And what we had was our daily 5 p.m. email became something that managers looked forward to, in inverted commas, and they knew that was their source of information. What they needed to know, what we wanted them to do, what resources there were, etc., was coming at 5 p.m. and they didn't worry about anything else. So it was very much a rhythm. And one of my colleagues, a friend of my colleagues, said, "Oh, that's a battle rhythm." I went, "Never heard of that." So as you do, you Google it, and lo and behold, there's loads of articles there about the military and their use of the term battle rhythm. So we adopted the term. So we had a battle rhythm from the top of the organisation right through.
And did the top team experience it as the term suggests, a kind of, going into battle. Was it
Yeah,
that kind of
yes.
experience for them?
Yeah, it was. It was intense. I think knowing we were going to have the meeting, there was an agenda, actions, etc., were done for 8 a.m. and you had then the day to go through it. So I think it gave a structure, a focus for everybody, if I'm being honest, from myself right down. So yeah, it was a real big. I think everybody looks back and says that was one of the things we got right, very much so.
And was there a time when the pace started to not necessarily slow, but take a different kind of timbre? Was there a phased approach that allowed you to say, okay, so we're through this first bit, we think. We now need to have slightly different kinds of conversations,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
the context is now changing and the messages from the government might be changing, the guidance.
Yes, very much so. So I think it was probably about 5 weeks. We developed our an understanding of what we thought our journey would be like, and that changed about 3 or 4 times. And we thought at the beginning, I did this really nice flow charty thing about, oh, this will be our journey, this will happen, and that will happen, and that lasted about a week, and I'll go back to the drawing board. But we had, well, we called it our crisis response phase. I think that was about 4 to 5 weeks where we were making decisions at pace about things. So it involved furlough, pay, PPE, which I suspect we'll come on to, all sorts of organisational change, offices locking them down, etc.
Yeah.
So our lawyer said very early on, whatever you do, keep a log of every decision you make. So we did. Always follow the advice of a lawyer, I find. And we had over 900 individual decisions that we've kept a record of decisions we made and then changed, etc., right through that whole period. The vast majority of those was in what we've called that crisis response period, which was about 4 to 5 weeks. And after that, we then started, the meetings slowed. After about 3 months, we moved away from daily to 3 times a week, and we now, today, in early July, we're doing once a week. Although we are mindful if a second wave comes and we start to see more local lockdowns, which will affect our services, we may have to increase that frequency.
And what phase are you in now? Are you in a kind of, okay, so now we're looking very firmly to the future, or is it still a kind of guarding what you've created and what you've managed kind of phase?
I think there's half an eye, if you like, on how things are and are things still happening as we want them to happen. But the rest of our focus is now on the future, what we call the recovery phase, which is very much planning and taking a pause. One of the things I noticed was, and I have noticed it since, is I was probably the first person ready to have the conversation about recovery, and my colleagues weren't quite there yet.
Really?
And I've seen that as those conversations have filtered down through the leadership group, the middle management spheres. We're always, the further up you are in the organisation, the more ready you are to move on and have those sort of conversations. And we've had to bring people with us. I remember my HR director, when she says, when we had our first call, it was, you must have felt like you were drawing teeth. And I said, yeah, it was pretty much, because and what I've recognised were people who are in different places in that journey mentally in terms of what they're dealing with. So our HR teams were probably earlier ready sooner than our operational teams, for example, because they're still living and breathing some of this stuff. So we're in recovery, and that's very much planning for the future. So we've come up with a plan, and we've got different phases of work. Yeah.
And do you think the organisation will be different, is different as a result of what you've been through?
Yes, I don't think any organisation can go through this and be ever the same again. I think we are, I guess, like most organisations, thinking about what our future ways of working will be. Yeah. Early on, we set back in March, mid-teens of the week and a bit of March. I remember my chair. So we're a voluntary organisation. We have a board of trustees, and the chair, he was in Chile when it hit, and he got the last plane out of Chile, literally as the borders were closing. And he arrived back, and he came back to a very, very different country. And we had a very, very helpful, clear conversation very, very early on around what our three priorities were. So as lockdown happened, we're in the midst of launching a new 5-year organizational strategy. Well, that's been paused. And we identified three priorities. So we support people with learning disabilities and autism, about 3,500 of them. So priority number one was to keep as many of those people alive as possible. Second one was to keep our colleagues safe, well, healthy, and focused on that first priority. And the third one was to have a fit-for-purpose organisation when we came out of this.
That's interesting.
And everything else was put to one side. So if you like, everything we did had to tick one of those boxes. They were our litmus tests.
They were declared at the beginning, were they?
Yeah, I think by the end of that first week, when I came back from that long weekend, those were the three things we were all focused on, and everything else was just put to one side. Had to tick one of those boxes, or don't bother, don't do it, park it. And that helped all those decisions we've made. So we've paused loads of activity in the organisation because it's not relevant anymore. At this point in time, that is not relevant. It's got to focus on one of those. So that's where a lot of those decisions were coming down.
And what conversations did you have at the top team around particularly that third priority in the early phases? Was it quite, because I can imagine it might be quite difficult to get your head around. Oh gosh, I'm trying to do the first two. I can't think about the third one yet.
I think there are two bits that stick in my mind. The one thing I said to my colleagues really early on is how we lead the organisation through this period will shape the organisation for years to come. The organisational memory of the lead, not my leadership, the leadership of the organisation will set the legacy for years. And if we do it well, we will have a positive legacy. And if we mess it up, we won't. So that was really clear. Think about your impact upon 7,000 colleagues. And the other one was just, the bread and butter money. Were our local authorities going to be able to pay us? So we have 90 local authority commissioners, and we're not for profit, and we don't do fundraising, etc. So we are reliant on our contract income. So bluntly, were we going to be able to get our invoices out, and were local authorities going to pay us? So we have a team of 9 people who send our invoices out, and it's an extremely complicated part of our world. So that team had to be on the money, so to speak. And actually, were local authorities going to have high sickness levels? Were their systems going to crash, etc.? Were we going to get cash in the business? So those, I guess, were 2 examples. I think there are a number of them, but those are the 2 that really stick in my head today about having a fit-for-purpose organisation. I wanted to be able to pay my staff, frankly.
It is interesting because I think we've all come to realise how connected we are, and those examples show exactly how one organisation can be so interconnected with others and with the community and with the other parts of the economy. And it threatens one's survival if that delicate balance is played around with.
I think one of the things I think we got really right was our use of technology. So like most organisations, we really struggle with accurate data, and we soon got over ourselves quite soon. Is it good enough to work on? So one of the things, our IT team did a brilliant job by setting up some live data tables for us. So before the PERT call at 8 a.m, I would be able to go into our system and find out the value of the invoices sent out the previous day and that week, and was it on target. So we set up some really, for us, it's almost miraculous to be able to have live data, and I mean, on the money live. So that was something that was really good. And we had various data things like how many people we support were in hospital, how many staff were off sick, how many people we support were in isolation. Are we getting the money in? Are we getting the invoices out? Are people paying us? Is our IT system robust? Is it, how many lost connections, etc., etc. So all sorts of key data, daily, weekly, and monthly, really helped us manage that business. So the bit I'd recognise is that that come back to those three priorities, having a fit for purpose organisation. That was communicated throughout the whole organisation.
Right.
So as well as our daily communications, which is now less frequent, I was doing a weekly blog to all my colleagues around it, and I was up front in one of the very early ones around that, what those three priorities were, and I've kept referencing them throughout. And that helped the IT team, had a whole range of exciting initiatives they were doing, but actually, you know what, put those to one side. The organisation needs data to manage the risks.
Yeah.
So that was really important.
Yeah. So it's back to the intensity and the focus.
Yeah.
You had in that
Yes, very much so.
And you mentioned PPE. We would be remiss not to mention it, bring it back into the conversation. What thoughts do you have about that? Because that, I mean, it's not a cheap kit, is it? I mean, for a start, you should just be talking about the money. And the supply chain was a bit wonky, as far as a layperson could see.
Yes.
Not an easy thing to make sure that you had enough of, and therefore could keep everybody safe.
Well, in the organisation now, it's known as FPPE, and the F does stand for what you think. To give you some context, David, we use PPE for some of the stuff we do all the time, and always have used it. So our spend roughly was about £25,000 a month before this started. At one stage, we were modelling our usage at over £400,000 per month. So that gives you a quantum of the sort of like the growth in the use of the stuff. I mean, the government's guidance shift. I have lost track of how many times the PPE guidance has shifted. I know it exceeds 10. And each time we were trying to work out what that meant for our colleagues and then put that in the daily briefing. So it's probably one of the things we struggled most with to get on top of, A, in terms of understanding what we're supposed to be doing with it, and B, getting it. We decided very early on that we had no choice but to follow the government guidance to the letter. And we have done that throughout. So all the various things they've done in terms of furlough, PPE, etc., social distancing, we've followed that. And that's been helpful in the sense we've been able to signpost to our 7,000 colleagues, why are we doing that? Because that's what the government guidance says. So that simplified life in some ways, because we didn't have to sort of like work it out. We just worked out what it meant for us. But getting back to PPE, really interesting. I remember a conversation we had one night. I think it was about 7:30. So one of my colleagues, who's director of development and housing, he became sort of like director of PPE procurement for about a month. One of many colleagues whose day job basically just dried up, and they found something, that we redeployed them. So all of my business development team became PPE procurement people for about a month. And we had a conversation, and he'd managed to track down this potential supply of masks and gloves for £500,000. And there was about a 3-week delivery on it. And we remember having the conversation, are we just going to go for it? And we worked out we needed to have board approval for that, not so unsurprisingly. So I was phoning the chair up. I was like, I'm really sorry. I want to spend £500,000 on PPE. Can I do it, please?
That was a light conversation.
It was a very polite, and to be fair, it was a very quick conversation. Yeah, of course. So we got it. So that, I guess, that's one of our war stories. That's one of the things we'll talk about over a beer whenever we get together. Do you remember that night when we spent £500,000 on masks, that sort of thing? So it was really. It was one of those key bits of that journey. Going back to our management data, one of the things I wanted to do was understand our stock levels. I wanted to know how many days stock we had left. So that took us about a week to get on top of that. And Chris, the director, did a really cracking job in setting in place systems and processes so we were able to know how many days stock we had left. And I remember one of those infamous government guidance changes. We had a position, our stock levels, we had, I think it was about 3 weeks stock left, and we had this big order coming in from China, etc. And the government guidance changed that night. So the day after, we had a PERT call, and I remember the conversation. He said, We did have 3 weeks stock left. We've now got 5 days because the usage ramped up significantly, and that was a bit of a scary moment, to be fair.
Mm-hmm.
But we managed to get through it, and we did get some more stock. And today we're in a good place. We've got weeks of stock left for everything, but we're getting through a lot of it. So we've managed to bring our prices down. We're trying to work with some peer organisations to do some joint procurement to see if we can bring the prices down more.
Mm-hmm.
So I think at the moment our monthly usage is somewhere south of 300,000.
Goodness me, and that's quite a burden for the organisation to bear, isn't it?
It is. So the local authorities, we've got 90 local authorities. Some have been really great and stepped up and followed the LGA guidance about how they are supposed to work with us and help us, give us more money now and worry about the paperwork later.
Yeah.
We've got one infamous local authority I won't name is making us fill out a spreadsheet detailing every mask we use and give them a copy of our receipts before they give us a penny. So we've got a spectrum of local authorities in terms of how they are working with us and helping us, or not, as the case may be.
Again, that's to my mind, with my systems hat on, I'd say that was an example of anxiety still in the system. You know, people are anxious to make sure that they're covered. Therefore, the spreadsheet comes out. Therefore, the pressure is, you know, deflected, and the fear and anxiety pops out in the system in another way.
I think what I'd say is the pandemic has magnified behaviour. So those organisations who we had a really good relationship with and very constructive, open, have been the best organisations to work with. And those who we've always struggled with, have always been a bit anal, have always been a bit dictatorial, have become more so. So it's almost like your organisational behaviour has just magnified. But that's certainly our experience of our commissioners. The vast majority, I have to say, have been absolutely brilliant. They are in a really tough place at the moment.
I'm going to move us on now into the kind of the last third of this conversation, which has been fascinating. And I want to talk about teamship and your top tips and the kind of the learning that you've been able to accrue over this time, because it's the intensity generates a huge amount of learning for you and your team. And I'm going to introduce the idea of teamship, which we're keen on in the Centre for Teams. And I'll make sure that it's clear what teamship means, so you can kind of talk into that space. For us, it entails bringing together talented individuals to achieve results through some order of collective endeavour. Clearly, this applies to a top team, an executive team. And it requires the development of a compelling purpose, alignment with stakeholder need, and clearly you've got a number of different kinds of stakeholders as well, so a complex map of stakeholders. A healthy and effective dynamic within that team, a clear and a coordinated set of actions and continuous learning over time. And it also, of course, requires good team membership and good team leadership that then one would hope would be instigated across the organization in other teams as well, because you're leading teams, not just individuals. So what were your lessons, given that kind of description that we have of teamship? I'm wondering what key lessons for teamship you've accrued from your experiences over the last few months. And it could be centered on your top team. You've spoken about your colleagues and the kind of rhythm that you got into, but it could also be observations out there in the organization.
Okay. I think having a clear organizational purpose was a significant advantage to us. So I think we have built up a lot of internal social capital throughout the organization, and I think we've been drawing on that. So what we exist for is to help people learn disabilities and people who have autism to have a great life, in shorthand. So that has really helped people focus on it. So you've had, as I mentioned before, David, lots of people whose day job dried up became really focused on helping keep people alive and keep our colleagues safe and healthy. So that's been a real real benefit. I think having those three priorities was a real key step, I think, in helping get us through it. The other thing I recognised was, as I said earlier, about the how we lead through the organisation will shape the organisation for years to come. The legacy part of that. So for me, there was three things I noticed rather. There was the managing the organisation through the crisis in those early 4 or 5 week periods when it was full on. I mean, 12, 13, 14-hour days, etc. So managing that response, and then also leading the organisation out of it. So there's managing the crisis and leading the organisation, and we're in the midst of that now, trying to work out what the future is going to look like. But the thing that was different, I think, this time, I did an awful lot of reading also during that period, and what I'd read about in terms of other business crises periods was this one was very different in the sense of it was affecting us 24/7. So even if you turn you log off at whatever time of night it was, and you go and relax, you can't go out. Am I going to get some toilet roll? Am I going to get some fresh veg? So it was in your face 24/7. It wasn't disappearing when you turn off your job. And so what I noticed was the amount of individual support and leadership of individuals was higher as a result. So you have most of us have organizations, in our organizations, people who are really resilient, very, very low maintenance, etc. And I think what I noticed was everybody's personal maintenance needs had gone up a couple of notches.
Okay.
So there was those three challenges: managing the crisis, leading the organization out, and just supporting people. And that third strand was noticeably higher than I would have ordinarily anticipated. So that's what I've noticed, I think.
That's interesting. And in that third area, then, when you're supporting individuals, is that an emotional support, or is that about direction and agreement of goals and activity? What was it? Was it about that relationship piece, or was it about task?
It was about relationship, I think. Because I think colleagues didn't need to be told what they needed to do or why. It was about helping them cope through that period. So it was very much about the emotional support of people. Was something that I think I noticed we were doing more of it as we were going along.
It's interesting that this bit of the conversation has echoes again of other organisations and other leaders we've spoken to, where it feels that the organisation has turned up the caring notch a little bit.
Very much
Not one didn't care before,
no.
But one is paying attention to the emotional landscape in a way that actually ordinarily you felt you didn't need to do, because people were kind of masters of their own domain and looked after themselves or needed support. And if they needed it, they'd shout. But there was a kind of everybody's antenna is a little bit more acutely kind of tuned up.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So what are your top tips there for other chief executives and other senior leaders going through this kind of crisis? Because there will be other things, like not necessarily as grand a scale and as so threatening and concerning, but I think being able to deal with moments of crisis is a really important idea, and be able to adapt, for teams in particular to adapt. So what are your top tips for CEOs and senior leaders?
Being really clear what's important, setting those three priorities so early on, and then making sure the whole organization knew what they were, and sticking to keeping them as the priorities was probably the best thing we did. The other good thing we did was that rhythm, personal as well as organization. So I had my own personal battle rhythm, so that I would get up a certain time, do some exercise, make sure I was having some breaks, and I was encouraging my other colleagues to do that. So to understand what the rhythm is in the organization. Crystal clear communication. I mean, so we have 7,000 colleagues dispersed across England and Wales. So making sure they had good, reliable information at a certain time was a really good thing, and just being really clear about why. So that was I think I'd add recognizing that things won't be perfect, and just recognizing that you can't control this at the center. You can set the tempo, you can set the framework, you can set the guidance, but you then have to trust people locally to get on with it. So I've got 300 frontline managers. They've been absolutely fantastic in the last few months in terms of just how they've led their services and their colleagues really, really well.
But presumably that was also a function of your relationship with them in the past.
Yes.
So that trust was already established, and you that was echoed early in our conversation about the kind of organization that you lead. It's very difficult to trust people immediately to go on and do stuff if that wasn't there in the first place.
No, absolutely. I think we've been able to draw from our base purpose, what the organisation exists for. That's obviously helped us in that sense. I think we have built up social capital by how we've tried to lead the organisation and engage our workforce over the time. So I think that certainly, as I said earlier, that certainly built up some social capital which we've used. I think having that, the purpose of the organisation, I keep going back to it, we've certainly benefited from that. So I've had some fantastic examples of people. I've had I think of a locality manager very, very early on, self-isolated from her family so she could be there with her colleagues. I've had a support worker hire a camper van and park on a services drive. He's 14 weeks, he's still there, self-isolating from his family. My PA became a taxi driver at night for night staff when the buses weren't running in the local area. So throughout the organisation, we've had people just step up, use the old hackneyed phrase. They really have just stepped up and recognised they have a contribution to make, and they really care about what we're here for. And I've seen that day in, day out throughout the whole of this last horrible period of just people doing that for the people we support, because that's basically what we're here for.
I think you've just asked my final question, which was the many examples of humanity. But it is extraordinary, the kind of things that we've witnessed, even just as a member of the public, to look at newspapers and hear stories in one's local community. It is extraordinary how people have contributed and thought personally about what they can do. And that's alive and well in organisational life too, which is great news to hear, isn't it?
Yes, very much so. And we need to think through, part of our recovery planning phase now is, how do we make sure people hear the thank you later on? Yes. I say it consistently now, sat in my little office at home by email, but how do we, when we're allowed to be face to face, how are we going to say that then and just recognise it? So that's a real key part of looking forward. It's not just about, okay, so get back to normal and blah, 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 but also just give the organisation time to recuperate, dare I say, celebrate, commemorate.
Steve, I'm going to bring this to a graceful conclusion. Thank you so much for sharing, as you have, the story of Dimensions, your leadership of it, and of the top team as well. It's been absolutely fascinating to hear you talk. Thank you very much. And I look forward to welcoming you back when we launch our podcast, and you can talk more about your observations about leadership in organisational life. So thank you very much. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, David. Cheers.